And our next speaker is Dr. Christopher Preston from the Department of Philosophy at the University of Montana. And Dr. Preston has been working in the area of environmental ethics for about 30 years. He has many publications. He has a book called Climate Justice and Geoengineering, Ethics and Policy in the Atmospheric Anthropocene, and he published that in 2016. And he has a forthcoming book with MIT Press called The Synthetic Age, Outdesigning Evolution, Resurrecting Species, and Reengineering Our World. Dr. Preston.
Okay. Thank you, Pradeep. Thank you, Julian. I'm tempted to start with a Monty Python line, and now for something completely different. Different because I don't have data, graphs, or equations. I'm an ethicist. I'm a philosopher. But if I were to say that what I'm going to do is completely different, I would be lying, because in every presentation we've had over the last day or so, there has been ethics. If you're talking about health, there's ethics. If you're talking about floods, there's ethics. If you're talking about the dangers of extreme weather events, there's ethics. If you're simply talking about economic costs, there's ethics. So actually all I'm doing is I'm being explicit about stuff that has been implicit in everything that we've discussed over the last couple of days. I'm going to focus particularly on this idea of climate justice. Climate justice is a buzzword right now. It's all over the academic journals in ethics and humanities, and it's all over street protests when you see climate types of activism. Climate justice typically is associated with the issue of disproportionate burdens. Who faces climate burdens, and how great are those burdens? And the concern often is that the people facing those burdens are not the people who have generated or caused those burdens. So there are disproportionate impacts of climate change, and there's a fundamental injustice there in those disproportionate impacts. That's actually not the area of climate justice I'm going to focus on. I'm hopefully going to open your eyes to a different area of climate justice, where we don't look so much at burdens, we look at something else. Now, to get there, I have to do a little bit of a kind of a detour, go roundabout to get to this different area of climate justice. And I'm going to do that detour through a little discussion of the ethical debate over genetically modified foods. Let me say right away that I'm not taking a position on genetically modified foods. But what I want to do is sort of show you where the ethics in this debate lies, and then that might give us some hints about this other type of climate justice that I want to discuss. So quite a lot of the debate about genetically modified foods is focused on, obviously, the health impacts, the environmental impacts, and the economics of GMOs. And those are all important parts of the debate for sure. But there's a whole lot of other stuff that people get agitated about with GMOs. And these are more sort of, perhaps not as concrete, perhaps a little bit more abstract, perhaps a little bit more philosophical, but things to do with relationships with nature, approaches to precaution and uncertainty, large-scale visions about what agriculture is for, issues of freedom, etc., issues of power. Now, that second kind of set of concerns I raised seem initially like they're secondary. You'd think like the health, economy, environment ones were primary, and those other ones were secondary. But that's not often the case. And this quote illustrates the point I want to make. It's perhaps a little bit inaccurate, but when Gaskell suggests that moral doubts tend to kind of win the day in the debates over genetically modified foods, what he's talking about are those more sort of qualitative, those more philosophical doubts, rather than those issues of risks to health, economy, or environment. It's a little bit of a misquote because it sort of suggests that those risks to health, economy, and environment excuse me, are not moral problems. Those are moral problems as well. But definitely the finger is being pointed here towards those latter sets of concerns. So if we could line these concerns up against each other, on the left we have concerns about welfare. On the right, we have other sorts of concerns, which I'm suggesting are equally as important, or they're certainly concerns that get people agitated about GMOs. Just notice that if you wanted to study the stuff on the left, you would want to talk to atmospheric scientists, you'd want to talk to crop scientists, you'd want to talk to economists, you'd want to talk to all the people that we've heard from in this conference. If you wanted to study the stuff on the right, you would want a different kind of discussion. You'd want to maybe talk to historians or ethicists, political theorists, religious studies folks. It's a different kind of debate, different kind of metric. Something else I want to say about what's on the left is issues on the left, when we're talking about justice, are largely about distribution. So are the benefits there? Are they being distributed fairly? Are the costs manageable? And are those being distributed fairly? So the paradigm on the left is, it's roughly a utilitarian cost-benefit analysis paradigm focused on distribution. On the right, it's something else. Let me talk about another technology now. This is another kind of way into the discussion. This one has a little bit more to do with climate. But I'm just using this example to get to the same point about two ways of looking at justice. And I'm not, like with GMOs, I'm not going to take a position on climate engineering. It would have been fun yesterday to have heard from Gunnar Wagner, who was going to talk about climate engineering, but he couldn't make it due to the weather. So in this case, what are the issues that motivate or agitate people around climate engineering? At Montana, we had a project that ended a couple of years ago where we sent a student, then PhD student, Wiley Carr, now works for the US Fish and Wildlife Service. He went to the Solomon Islands, the Arctic, and to sub-Saharan Africa to ask people, if you were faced with the possibility of engineering of your climate to a cooler temperature, what are the sorts of things you would be concerned about? What are the moral issues in there for you? And of course, a lot of people said, well, I want to make sure that I was going to get benefited. I'd want to make sure my welfare went up. I want to make sure that we would be able to continue growing the crops we want. But in addition to those concerns, a lot of other concerns came up. So for example, I'm going to put a couple of quotations from some of the people Wiley talked to. Issues of fear and dependence were really important for people when contemplating climate engineering. Issues of power and history and circumstance were really important. And issues of self-determination, the ability to make decisions on your own for yourself, were really important. So we can parse these responses in the same way as we parse those ones to GMOs. And we can say, certainly, on the left, there are issues of welfare. I mean, these are significant issues. But then also there are other sorts of moral concerns that are key to climate justice when you're contemplating climate engineering. And these are different kinds of issues. So the things I said with GMOs, you can kind of say the same things here. On the left, you're going to study these things through atmospheric science, crop science, economics, et cetera, et cetera. On the right, you're going to want a different kind of mechanism, different kind of lens. So what is that lens? I'm going to drill down a little bit now as to what that sort of climate justice is going to be about. Okay. Let me pursue one line of thinking which looks promising initially, but then I want to suggest runs out of steam. So at the Doha COP meeting, COP 18 in 2012, there was a commitment to discuss the loss and damage from climate change. And part of that discussion of loss and damage was to include non-economic losses. Now, for a philosopher and ethicist, this is kind of very exciting because we were going to start talking about climate change and the losses and damages that were coming from climate change that were not in markets per se, but were things that might matter, especially to ethicists. And this discussion started off on the right foot, where the UNFCCC produced a technical paper that dove into what these non-economic losses were. And it listed things like this. So these were the kinds of in the right ballpark, if you like, issues of community, issues of security, issues of heritage and culture, issues that had that more qualitative, historical, philosophical kind of dimension to them. And there was a conference a couple of years back where a bunch of ethicists kind of got together to look at this technical paper that the UN produced and to ask the question, well, do these non-economic losses and damages, do these sort of line up with the types of concerns in climate justice that we think are being omitted? And it started off looking good, but then I've shaded some of those non-economic losses differently because as the paper continued, it started to look like these non-economic losses were getting cashed out in terms of things that were economic. And so things like ecosystem services, of course you can put a number value on that. Life, you can put a number value on it. We just had a number value on life. Territory, biodiversity. And then the paper went on to start discussing these non-economic losses as matters of natural, social, and cultural capital. And then a little later on, towards the end of the paper, there was actually a claim which, for all of us philosophers who were gathered at this meeting, was one that sort of made us philosophically indignant. And I think for philosophers that means you just make more intense, intricate arguments when you get indignant. But it included the claim that what we need to do is we need to put these non-economic losses together with the economic losses and come up with something called total economic loss. Which you can see why we got a little bit indignant about that, because the non-economic losses had suddenly been sort of placed in this category, total economic loss. Now, the hope was that we were going to get away from that welfare paradigm, get away from that CBA type of thinking, that distributional type of thinking. But in the end, that attempt didn't manage that. So let's think about a different track. Now I'm going to put out there the word that has gained popularity about this different track. This is justice known as recognitional justice. What is recognitional justice? Well, what is recognition? Think about in a debating chamber when the presiding officer says, I'd like to recognize the speaker from Illinois. What are they saying? They're saying that for that speaker, it's their turn, what they have to say is valuable, and that everybody else is going to give them their undivided attention. That's what recognition is at that sort of level of debating chambers. And one can characterize recognition very simply as something like making sure you're noticing people. At a very simple level, that's all it is. But you can layer things on and make it a little more complicated, if you like. So recognition is about situation. It's about the particular things that people bring to climate change, the particular types of positionality that makes climate change appear in a certain way for some people versus a different way for other people. And you can keep on adding layers to this, making recognition as sort of complex as you like. But however many layers you add, you're gonna come up with this idea that recognition has got a lot to do with paying careful attention. It's got a lot to do with being fully contextual. It's got a lot to do with taking history seriously. It's got a lot to do with taking the structures in society seriously. So it's a whole different kind of approach to cost-benefit analysis. And it requires a whole different type of lens, if you like, to detect when recognitional justice or adequate recognition is being achieved. I want to present a lens now. I've said that the cost-benefit analysis lens, the utilitarian lens, is good, but it doesn't cover all the bases. So what's a different kind of lens that might cover some of those other bases, those bases that are getting missed? So that lens is going to be an approach in ethics called the care approach. Care approach has been around for 35 or so years, something like that. It's very much a minority position in ethics. I mean, a lot of you have heard of utilitarianism in ethics. A lot of you have probably heard of rights-based approaches. Some of you might have heard of virtue-based approaches. Care-based approaches are less common. Pradeep actually studied with one of the care ethics greats. So there's certainly some penetration of care ethics into the philosophical community, but not as much as perhaps one might hope. So what is care ethics? Well, care ethics is varied. There's a lot to care ethics, but it is possible to identify a number of themes within it. And these are the themes that you could probably identify more, you could identify less. These are the themes that I suggest are the important ones in care ethics. And let me sort of explain a little bit what each of those themes means, and I'm going to explain them alongside images which are all taken from the climate disasters that have been hitting the United States in the last 3 weeks or so. Unlike ethical approaches that seek to be very mathematical, very distant, very universal, care ethics is very particular, very contextualized. It kind of looks at details and recognizes that the ethics is going to fall out in different ways depending upon the particular details of a situation. Care ethics is concerned about individuals, but is also concerned about relationships between individuals. It's concerned about the way people connect with each other in positive and negative ways, and the way people connect with the institutions that surround them in society. Care ethics is concerned about power. Care ethics actually originated in the feminist philosophical circles, where the personal is taken to be political and issues of power are very important. So care ethics is always looking at which way power is moving through society. Care ethics recognizes dependence. We're not all here in society equally. Some of us are more dependent. Some of us have greater needs in certain situations. And many of you will have seen this photograph. This one was from Hurricane Harvey in an assisted care facility, which was literally flooding around the people in there. And then in Irma, you'll remember as well, there was a horrible situation where the AC went out and 8 people in a care facility died because of the heat. Care ethics focuses on emotion and affect. Now, that it's worth mentioning because more traditional welfare types of approaches, rights types of approaches, think that ethics must be purely rational. Reason is the dominant faculty. Ethics needs to be dispassionate and as mathematical as possible. Here's a guy who's just lost his house in Montana about 3 weeks ago, and he's pretty upset about it. And so care ethics recognizes the legitimate place of emotion in the discussion of right and wrong. And finally, care ethics, you might have already been seeing this from what I've said so far, but because of its emphasis on context, because of its emphasis on history and positionality, care ethics embraces different kinds of modes of expression. And so narrative storytelling is a legitimate part of care ethics. It's not dismissed as somehow sort of folklore or anecdote. It actually has a solid place in discussions of justice. Okay, so those are the main themes in care ethics. What I'd ask you to do now is look at a couple more of those quotes that came from Wiley Carr, who did his research in Africa, the Solomon Islands, and the Arctic, and see if those care ethics themes sort of stand out when you look at these quotes. So here's somebody contemplating climate engineering, and perhaps even being open to climate engineering, but being concerned about traditional ways of knowing that are going to disappear under a climate engineering regime. Here is another person concerned about tradition and also concerned about the importance of worldview and whether climate engineering would be consistent with that worldview and whether that worldview would be able to persist in a climate engineering world. And then finally, here's another comment. You can see this person has a lot to be concerned about with issues of power and self-determination. So that care ethic lens seems to tap into the appropriate moral issues. And so if you sort of think back to what we were saying about GMOs right at the start, the suggestion would be that care approach can tap into those sorts of moral issues that often get neglected. So it would be a different type of justice. It would not be that distributive welfare type of paradigm, but it would be a different type of justice. There's things you might be concerned about with this care approach. And one of them is that it's perhaps a little bit too descriptive in that it says, okay, power is important, story is important, context is important, but it doesn't tell you what to do. It just says they're important. Look for them. Look for those issues. So it's too descriptive. It doesn't give you enough guidance. And another thing, also on this topic of guidance, one might be concerned that a care approach is too qualitative. It's not quantitative enough. You know, you can't actually say, well, how many units of power are in play here, or how many relationships are in play. It doesn't sort of work like that. So these are two worries that you might have with the care approach. So a couple of quick responses. First, to the idea that it's too descriptive. Well, in philosophy, the sort of antidote to being too descriptive is to be normative. Being normative means you actually give a rule or give a behavioral recommendation. And I think, yes, the care approach starts descriptive, but you can be normative pretty quickly. You can say things like, does this particular climate strategy, might be climate engineering, might be a particular adaptive strategy, does this type of strategy concentrate power? Does it distribute power? Does this type of strategy recognize and pay due attention to vulnerability, or does it just ignore it? Does it treat everybody the same? So there's ways to add normativity when you take the care approach. What about the concern that it's too qualitative? Well, I don't mean this facetiously, but that's how it is. You know, some of this stuff is qualitative. Ethics is not always mathematically precise. Some of it just requires discussing and thinking about it and then revisiting it later and thinking about it again. And then as the situation changes, thinking about it again. That's a lot of what ethics is. You can't expect ethics to deliver numbers always. So if you're focused in on this other type of climate justice, then this is sort of the world that we are going to be living in. These are the discussions that we're going to be having. Okay. To come to a close, I haven't said anything about resilience yet. And this conference is about climate resilience. But I think the tie to resilience is pretty clear, pretty obvious. Because it seems likely that just communities are going to be resilient communities. So why do I think that? Well, a just community has a complex web of mutually supportive connections in it. That's what a just community is. And because of those connections, because of that mutual support, it's likely to be more resilient. And a just community is likely to be more politically stable. And a more politically stable community will be a more resilient community. Even if that's not true, even if there is no connection between resilience and justice, presumably we would want our communities to be just anyway. So thank you for your attention.